The topic we're covering now is on the Mosaic covenant, which is rather extensive. It begins in Exodus chapter 20, and it covers the lack from chapter 20 through chapter 40 of the book of Exodus. It also includes all the book of Leviticus, the whole book of Numbers, and the first 28 chapters of the book of Deuteronomy. So for the sake of using some time, I won't bother reading the entire text of the Mosaic covenant. We're going to be dealing with some key elements and key highlights in the 55 minutes I'm allowed here. And the persons involved in the Mosaic covenant is God and Israel. It's introduced not in chapter 20, but in chapter 19. So let's look at Exodus chapter 19, and we'll look at verse 3. And Moses went up unto God, and Yahweh called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice, indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be mine own possession from among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. You shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak unto the children of Israel. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and said before them, and all these words which Jehovah commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, All that Jehovah has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people unto Jehovah. And these are the actual introductory words to the actual content of the Mosaic covenant that begins with chapter 20. And so the covenant is made between God and Israel, and is given to Israel. And specifically to Israel, it's not given to the Gentiles. It's not given to the church later on. And three passages, which I won't bother taking time to read, but you can mark these down. This includes in the Torah, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Deuteronomy 4, verses 7 and 8. And then in the prophets, in Malachi chapter 4, verse 4, chapter 4, verse 4, and also in the writings, in the book of Psalms, Psalm 147, verses 19 and 20. Psalm 147, verses 19 and 20. And the content of the Mosaic covenant is the law of Moses. And if you look at Exodus chapter 24, verses 1 through 11, Exodus 24, verses 1 through 11, we notice that the actual sealing of the Mosaic covenant is done by the Shekinah, or the Shekinah glory. And the Shekinah glory is always a visible manifestation of the presence of God with some measure of light of some kind, not always the same, but some similar things. And so it was sealed by the Shekinah glory. In chapter 24, verses 1 to 11, and it was visible to the elders of the congregation of Israel, to the whole people of Israel. And now the specific provision is what we call the law of Moses. And we often focus on 10 commandments, but the actual law of Moses contained not just 10 commandments, but a total of 613 commandments. Of these 613 commandments, 365 commandments were negative commandments, meaning things you were not allowed to do. And another 248 commandments were positive commandments, commandments that you were obligated to perform. And this Mosaic covenant is also a conditional covenant, so there are blessings for obedience and judgment for disobedience. And that focus is brought out in two passages in the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 15, verse 26, Exodus 15, 26, and chapter 19, verses 3 through 8, chapter 19, verses 3 through 8. And the key element in the Mosaic covenant is the issue of the blood sacrifices. Now, one key verses to look at will be Leviticus chapter 17. Leviticus chapter 17, and look at verse 11. 17:11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. Now I've given it to you upon the altar to make the atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by reason of the life. And this is a key element because what is heavy in the Mosaic covenant is the issue of the blood sacrifices. And so the key element of the blood sacrifices is specified in Leviticus 17:11, and there are a total of 5 different types of offerings in the book of Leviticus. In the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, issues of those 5 different categories, 5 different types of blood sacrifices. But one thing to note from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, Hebrews 10, 1 through 4, blood sacrifices covered the sin of the people. What it could not do is to remove the blood per se. They did provide for the forgiveness of sin and for the restoration of fellowship. So for the Jewish people, it restricted some of the provisions of the previous Noahic covenant. And in the 4 categories provided by the Mosaic law, first of all, the beasts, animals that were considered to be acceptable, they had to be both cloven hoofed, and they had to chew the cud. As far as fishes that you can enjoy, they had to have both fins and scales. As far as birds that were permissible to be eaten, no birds of prey could be partaken of. And the only category of insects allowed for eating was only one type of a locust. So although Moses clearly said, I'm allowed to partake of the locust, I've never been tempted to partake of even one locust. For the Jewish people, it added the death penalty for many other sins. In the Noahic covenant, the focus was on the issue of violating human life. But now with the Mosaic law, a lot of other sins require the death penalty. And just to give you a short list, the sin of adultery would be characterized by the death penalty, also worshiping idolatry, worshiping, cursing God, and cursing parents, and the breaking of the Shabbat, breaking of the Sabbath commandment. Although circumcision was already introduced, circumcision was not merely a sign of Jewish identity, but also the means of submission to the law. And that point was made in the book of Leviticus, chapter 12, verse 3. And while other people in ethnic groups about the same time also practiced circumcision, what was unique in Leviticus chapter 12, verse 3, is the day of the birth that had to be, when circumcision was to be performed, and that would be on the 8th day of life. But initially, for Jewish people, it was not the Mosaic covenant that required circumcision. Began early with the Abrahamic covenant. In the Abrahamic covenant, it was mandatory for Jews only. But the Mosaic covenant, it's mandatory for both Jews and Gentiles. Another key performance that was introduced, especially with the Mosaic covenant, is the observance of the Shabbat, the observance of the Sabbath. Now, the token of the covenant with the Noahic covenant was the rainbow, but with the Mosaic law, the token of the covenant was the Shabbat, the Sabbath. And furthermore, the requirement of the Sabbath was only relevant to Israel, and that was the token of the covenant. Let me give you some 4 passages of the scriptures where this became very relevant. In Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 to 17, Exodus 31, verses 12 to 17, it was a sign that Israel had been set up apart by God. And that became the token, the sign of the covenant. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 to 15, Deuteronomy 5, 12 to 15, it served as a sign for the Exodus. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 12, Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 12, 2012, it was a sign of Israel setting apart and a memorial of the Exodus. Also in Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 20, Ezekiel 20:20, it was a sign that God, the God of Israel, Yahweh, is Israel's God. And so the sign of the Mosaic covenant was the observance of the Sabbath. Now the Sabbath itself was not a creation ordinance. It began with Moses as a practice. So in chapter 16 of Exodus, verses 23 to 30, Exodus 16, verses 23 to 30, here you see the first command about the Sabbath. It was first mentioned in chapter 2 of Genesis. But as far as a command to be observed, that began with Moses. And the first actual Sabbath commandment is Exodus 16, 23 to 30. Later in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, it was also incorporated into the Ten Commandments. So you have 613 commandments. The main ones were first introduced by the Ten Commandments. And so when the Sabbath became a specific ordinance under the Mosaic law, it was incorporated into the Ten Commandments. However, the Sabbath was a day of rest. It was not a day of corporate worship. Never was the Jews told, set up a weekly Shabbat service. The Sabbath was merely to be a day of rest, but not a day requiring corporate worship. Furthermore, the Shabbat, the Sabbath, was intended only for Israel. It was never intended for the church. And furthermore, as a sign of the Mosaic covenant, it was enforced only as long as the covenant was in force. As long as the covenant no longer was in force, it would no longer be a requirement. Now the question comes out, what is the purposes in introducing the Mosaic covenant and so on? First of all, it was not for the purpose. It was never a means of salvation. You never earned salvation by keeping the Shabbat. So what was the purpose of it? The purpose was in different categories. First of all, in relationship to the God of Israel, the purpose of the Shabbat was to reveal the holiness of God and the standard of righteousness which He demanded. As a system that would teach you how to keep the issues very well based upon the Mosaic law. So again, it revealed the holiness of God and the standard of righteousness which He demanded. From the Hebrew Bible, you see this in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 1, 2, and 37. Leviticus 19, verses 1, 2, and 37. As we find in the New Testament, it's 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, 1 Peter 1, 15 and 16. And Paul writes in Romans 7, verse 12, Romans 7, verse 12, the Lord's self was holy, righteousness, and good. There's never any problem with the Lord's self. But it was a standard of righteousness that shows the nature of God. A second category of purposes is the relationship to Israel. And one of these purposes in connection with Israel is to keep Israel distinct. To keep Israel distinct. Key passages are Leviticus 11, verses 44 and 45, Leviticus 11, 44, 45, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, also chapter 14, verse 1 and 2, chapter 14, verse 1 and 2. And some other specifics in connection with Israel, the Jewish people were now restricted in their diet. Many books you read about the dietary laws, they often emphasize the fact that these dietary laws were given to keep Jewish people healthy. But not once does the Bible say that's the purpose. Rather, the restricted diet was not for health, but for distinctiveness. Foods that Gentiles could eat, but Jews could not eat. So it's a restricted diet not for the purpose of health, but for distinctiveness. Furthermore, other distinctives are clothing. For example, you cannot wear any clothing that were mixed with mixed threads. You cannot have different combinations of threads to wear those kind of garments. Furthermore, on the four corners of your garments, you have to wear tassels. All Orthodox Jews to this day have these tassels on the four corners of their clothing. As far as beards, Jews could, under the Mosaic law, Jews could not shave, nor could they cut off their beard, nor could they even round their beards. It had to be cornered. So those who have had beards in accordance with the Torah, it had to have cornered, like almost a square beard. Another purpose for the Jewish people is served as a rule of life for the Old Testament saint. It was not a means of earning salvation. And we find this in Romans chapter 3, verse 20, Romans 3:20, Galatians 2, verse 16, Galatians 2:16, Galatians 3, verse 11 and 21, Galatians 3, verses 11 and 21. It was not a means of earning salvation. It was merely a rule of life for those who already were believers. And Leviticus provides three passages about it being a rule of life. Leviticus 11, verses 44 and 45, 44 and 45, chapter 19, verse 2, 19:2, chapter 20, verses 7, 8, and 26, Leviticus 20, verse 7, 8, and 26. Also, New Testament, it points out that the Torah was a means of a rule of life. Romans chapter 3, verse 28, Romans 3:28. Now, a third category as a rule of life, to provide for Israel occasions for individual and corporate worship. One key chapter is Leviticus chapter 23. In Leviticus 23, it points out the different types of festivals and festivities that Jews were to incorporate during the period of each year. So provided for Israel the different types of special honors and special observances. So for Israel, it provided 3 times in Leviticus 23, a time of equal worship. Now, third purpose in relationship to the Gentiles. For the Gentiles, it is to serve as a middle wall of partition to keep Gentiles from enjoying the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. Again, the purpose relationship to Gentiles to serve as a middle wall of partition to keep Gentiles away from enjoying the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. And this point is made in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 16. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 16. Another purpose has to do in connection with sin. The key passage is Romans chapter 7, verse 7 to chapter 8, verse 4. Romans 7, 7 to chapter 8, verse 4. And there are 4 lessons about the purpose in connection to sin. First of all, to show what sin is, to clearly reveal exactly what sin can and will do. Romans chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, Romans 3, 19 and 20, chapter 7, verse 7, Romans 7, 7, and Galatians chapter 3, verse 19 to chapter 3, verse 19, to clearly reveal to the Jewish people exactly what sin is. But it goes a bit further. A second purpose is to make one sin even more. To make one sin even more. So once you know what sin is, and you might want to quit making any acts of sin, what it will show us is to make us sin even more. That issue comes up 3 times in the book of Romans. Romans chapter 4, verse 15, Romans 4:15, chapter 5, verse 20, 5:20, and Romans 7, verses 8 through 11. Romans 7, verses 8 through 11. Let's look at a more specific passage. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now look at verse 56, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 56. The sting of death is sin, and the part of sin is the law. Just two phrases here, but it shows you, but by having the Torah and having all that doesn't really keep you from sinning. In fact, it encourages us to sin even more in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 56. A more extensive passage is the third issue, to show that one can do nothing on his own to please God. He'll never be able to totally stop sinning. To show one can do nothing on his own to please God. The extensive passage is Romans 7, verses 12 to 25. Romans 7, verses 12 to 25. And finally, the fourth purpose has to do to drive one to outer faith, to cause them to drive to fall on faith. You see this in Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, Romans 8, 1 through 4, and Galatians chapter 3, verses 24 and 25. Galatians 3, verses 24 and 25. Let's talk about the status of the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant came to an end, not with the arrival of the Messiah, but only with the death of the Messiah. As long as he was still living, all of these specific commandments were still obligatory for the Jewish people. But it came to a death only with the death of the Messiah. Let me bring out several elements. Turn for a moment to James chapter 2. James chapter 2. James chapter 2, and look at verse 10. James chapter 2, verse 10. Whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he's become guilty of all. And this shows that no matter how well they may keep these laws and so on, they'll never be able to keep it perfectly. In James chapter 2, verse 10, there is a special focus on the principle of unity of the law. Some people divide the Torah into 2 divisions. So you have the 10 commandments, also the other 603 commandments. There's also the 3-division view. But you can never divide all of these commandments into 2 divisions or to 3 divisions. In the 3 divisions, they divided into ceremonial laws and legal laws and moral laws. Ceremonial laws, legal laws, and moral laws. Now, this is not a bad way to categorize these different laws and so on, but what is missing is that by itself, it is never divided into 2 divisions or 3 divisions by the text of Scripture itself. The law is viewed as a unit. Either it is all in or all out. And James 2:10 teaches the principle of unity of the law. Romans chapter 7, verses 5 and 6, Romans 7, verses 5 and 6, Paul writes, "We have been discharged from the law." The law was one unit. It either was all in or all out. But we as believers have been discharged from the Torah, from the law. Romans chapter 10, verse 4, Romans 10, verse 4. Messiah is the end of the law unto righteousness. And what that means is, according to Galatians chapter 2, verse 16, Galatians 2:16, there is no justification through the law. In Hebrews chapter 7, verse 19, Hebrews 7, verse 19, there's no sanctification to the law. So there's no justification or sanctification that can be achieved. The key Greek word is telos, T-E-L-O-S, T-E-L-O-S. The primary meaning of the word telos is end or termination, but never the goal. Never the goal, but it was an end or termination. Another passage is Galatians chapter 3, verses 15 through 19, Galatians 3, verses 15 through 19. In verses 15 through 18, the law was merely an addition to the Abrahamic covenant to make sin very clear. And that's the point of chapter 3, verses 15 to 18. But he points out in verse 19, now that the seed has come, the law has come to an end. The Torah is no longer the mandatory rule of life. Another key passage is Galatians chapter 3, verse 23 through chapter 4, verse 7. Galatians 3, 23 to chapter 4, verse 7. The key verses are chapter 3, verses 23 to 25. And verse 24 says, the law was a tutor to bring one to the Messiah. But now we are no longer under the tutor in verse 25. So later in chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, we are focusing specifically on Jewish believers. We have been redeemed from the law. Turn to Ephesians chapter 2. I won't take time to read the whole passage, but we'll bring out the key elements of that passage. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 18 is the whole passage. Ephesians chapter 2, 11 through 18. The more specific verses are verses 14 through 16, 14 through 16. So let's look at the passage, verse 11. Wherefore remember that once ye the Gentiles in the flesh were called uncircumcision by that which is called circumcision in the flesh made by hands, that at that time separate from Messiah, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of the promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. But now in Messiah Yeshua, Messiah Jesus, Ye that have once were far off are made nigh or near in the blood of the Messiah. For he is our peace, who made both one, and broke down the middle wall of partition, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, that he might create in himself of the two one new man, and so making peace, and reconcile them both into one body unto God through the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. In this passage points out that the unity of believers until the coming of the Messiah, he points out that what God provided before the coming of the Messiah, that the law served as a middle wall of partition to separate Jews from Gentiles. But the wall has now been broken down. And so now all believers, Jewish believers and Gentile believers, are all now united into one body. Let's turn to Hebrews 7. Hebrews chapter 7. The key passage here is verses 11 through 18. Hebrews 7, 11 through 18. In verses 11 through 14, a new priesthood was required when you have a change of the law. And because of the future Melchizedekian priesthood that was already prophesied back in Psalm 110, now here in verses 11 through 14, now that we have a new priesthood, required a change of the law. So in verses 15 to 17, a future Melchizedekian priesthood implied a change of the law that would take place. So what was anticipated now shows has been fulfilled, and the fulfillment is in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 18. Hebrews 7, verse 18. Now turn just to observe 2 Corinthians chapter 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 3. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 through 11, chapter 3, verses 2 to 11, he now focuses not on the whole Torah. He's focusing more specifically on the Ten Commandments. And he specifies the Ten Commandments because he focuses in chapter 3, verse 3, that these are engraven on stones. 2 Corinthians 3, verses 2 through 11, but now he's focusing not in general, but specifically on commandments engraven on stone. These were the Ten Commandments. And he refers to the Ten Commandments in two ways. First of all, in verse 7, it's a ministration of death. And secondly, in verse 9, it is also a ministration of condemnation. So it doesn't show spiritual life. It's called demonstration of death, demonstration of condemnation. And the key word used in verse 7 and verse 11, a key Greek word. In verse 7, verse 11, katargeo, K-A-T-E-R-G-E-O, K-A-T-A-R-G-E-O. Literally, it means to be rendered inoperative. The word appears twice in this context in chapter 3, verse 7 and verse 11. Chapter 3, verse 7 and verse 11. That was required previously has now been rendered inoperative. And now they have a superiority of the law of the Messiah, no longer the law of Moses, but the law of the Messiah. And in chapter 3, verses 7 through 11, he uses the word katargero to emphasize the fact it will never be rendered inoperative. Will never be rendered inoperative. So today we are not under law. But 3 times in the New Testament, we are not under law, but we are under grace. three times in the book of Romans, chapter 6, verse 14, chapter 6, Romans 14, twice in chapter 7 of Romans, verse 4 and verse 6, verse 4 and verse 6, but also Galatians 5, verse 18, Galatians 5, 18. So no longer is the law of Moses in effect, now it's the law of the Messiah that's got come into effect. And the key passages include Romans chapter 8, verse 2, Romans 8, verse 2, and Galatians chapter 2, verse 6, Galatians chapter 2, verse 6. So what does this all mean, simply in practical terms? Now that we are under grace, we who are believers are free from any obligation to continue obeying the commandments of Moses. We're free from that obligation. We're now operating under the law of the Messiah. Now, if we choose, we are free to obey those commandments one chooses that does not violate the New Testament, but recognizes four things. Again, we're free to obey certain commandments if we so wish. To do that does not violate the New Testament, but recognizes four things. First of all, there is no value in adding other commandments that are not part of the commands of the Messiah. There's no value in justification. That'll bring us to salvation. Secondly, there's no value in sanctification. We can choose to keep these other commandments, but then it won't add anything to our sanctification process. Thirdly, it doesn't add any special merit to our obedience to the God of Israel. And fourthly, there's no specific increase of either spirituality or even of Jewish identity. Amongst some Messianic Jewish circles, what happens is they want to make sure that they have special emphasis for spirituality. And they look in the mirror and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the most Jewish of us all?" But in reality, we have commandments to obey, but does not increase anything in our spirituality or any increase of our Jewish identity. So this was a law code that we had to follow. The other law codes we no longer had to follow. We could follow some of those, but they will not add to our spirituality. But we are to be obedient to what is relevant as now as being believers and part of the Messiahship and members of the body of the Messiah. The Mosaic covenant provided for the dispensation of the law, but you are now in a different dispensation, the dispensation of grace, and that is what should be our focus in our daily living. Selah. I'm finished.